Okay, yes, I'm ready for the next slide whenever. Also, Mrs. Madera and Teacher Cheryl put together a little puppet show for us at the end as a little treat. The fairy tale. If you want your children to be intelligent, read them fairy tales. If you want them to be more intelligent, read them more fairy tales. Albert Einstein. So you can listen or read at your own leisure. Also called household tales by Brothers Grimm, the fairy tales, for me and scores of others, are subconscious representation of our own personal journey, our inner struggle. Each tale may speak to each person in a slightly different way. While they are all said to hold deep meaning, some stories will be held dearly, while others will seem completely nonsensical or even bring up feelings of discomfort. Recognizing this discomfort will have significance in itself. The tales are not intended to be taken literally. This is something that may be harder for the adults to achieve than the children. Children are, by nature, closer to the fantastical dream world than we are. We adults are much more entrenched in our intellect. Waldorf pedagogies say that to bring our literal awareness to our children too soon can actually disrupt the child's natural development. This is a completely different experience than that of the television or movie program. From the screen, the images are presented and permanent. There is no room for imagination. Even storybooks do not have the ephemeral and nebulous, oh, the screen just cut out on that part. We're working on it. Quality of a spoken fairy tale. Okay, thank you. And you'll see on each slide, Teacher Cheryl has incorporated her puppet show table display. So you're seeing how she is acting out different tales. Bree, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I was just going to say this was actually one of the places where we had probably the longest discussion on this, was just this idea that, you know, we really do try to hold the child's innocence, if you will, and we compared to, way, say, maybe in traditional education, they would just, like, I always use the example I got given of training of, like, tell them about the deforestation of the rainforest in, like, first grade, and that this is this huge heady concept for them to comprehend, versus that there's these fairy tales where these things can happen in these fairy tales that can seem very harsh to us as an adult, but because the child knows at a, like, deep level that the fairy tale is a fantasy, it's a fantastical experience, that they're sort of absorbing this hardship at a level that's developmentally appropriate for them. Like, they know it's fantastical what's happening, but they're also kind of getting a chance to experience hardship in a way that their brain can take in. And that's probably a whole larger discussion separate of this presentation. And I think we'll talk about this later, that how much the story cycle is meant to directly speak to the development of the child at that age, including the hardship within the story cycle, is meant to be meeting the development of the child where they are. And we kind of each shared a story of experiences that we've had in the curriculum over the years, where we as adults, putting our adult head and our adult consciousness on it, had to kind of wrestle through what the story is, bringing the story, adapting the story, et cetera, and things like that, to bring it to the children, and what kind of came forth from that own inner work of ourselves, because Steiner talks so much about how important that inner work is for the development of the teacher. We'll go ahead and click forward, Riley.
Thank you. Yeah, one thing I shared with the group was that the year before taking my first grade class, I was in a fourth grade class at a local school, and they had a story that fourth graders read about a parent being in a car accident. And that's very real for some people, myself included in that. And it was really difficult to talk to fourth graders about that. And then just to feel the difference of moving from that world into a place with fairy tales was a very different feeling for me. Okay, continuing on. The fairy tale is one of the foundations of our language arts curriculum. Steeped in rich language and vivid imagery, hearing these tales encourages children to stretch their imagination, build focus, develop vocabulary and comprehension, and strengthen their ability to recall. In our fast-paced modern times, it is also a much-needed still point in the day, an in-breath. Over the years, I have striven to bring balance to the classroom with the fairy tales. My struggle has been to find a balance between archetype and stereotype in the stories, and also in holding interest but not bringing too much drama. All good, no worries. My solution has been to try to find stories that speak to me as well as the group before me, not an easy task when teaching remotely, and also to be sure to supplement the grim tales with those that include strong female characters and or represent diverse cultures. This year in the puppet shows, the knight was a girl who slayed the dragon in order to rescue the fair prince. The clever girl who outwitted the big bear had brown skin, and other characters have been gender neutral. The protagonist in Star Money trusts in the great good. And I just love this puppet display right here. It's my favorite.
This was another strong point of discussion too amongst our team at this meeting that, within Waldorf pedagogy, there's a very strong belief in the sort of intentional connection that the teacher has to the children, and that picking a story is not simply like, oh, I need a story to tell now, this will do, that there's a lot of higher order things that go into the selection of the story. Like, yes, there is the story cycle, and like, oh, story of the brown bear fits B, but also like, what in this story is feeding the children that are before me? What do they need? Who needs this nudge? Who needs this holding? Who needs this beautiful imagery? What do we need as a class from this story? And that's something really that the teacher is intentionally thinking of in every story that they select.
And I also believe that's part of why it's called a healing education, because we're able to bring those gifts and those students and those lessons through different stories. There are so many more profound thoughts on the fairy tale than what I have touched on here. Bruno Bettelheim's The Uses of Enchantment, The Wisdom of Fairy Tales by Rudolf Meyer, Clarissa Pinkola Estes's Women Who Run with the Wolves, and of course Rudolf Steiner's lectures are just a few examples of how we can dive more deeply into symbolism, relevance, and inner journeys associated with the fairy tale. And I believe the next slide is our puppet. Oh, our puppet show is after this. This is the spiral of Waldorf curriculum. And you'll see it's an inward and outward spiral in one. So if you follow the red line, that's where we start in the lower grades. So we start with fairy tales, legends, fables. And in third grade, we start with Old Testament, going into sagas, epics. You'll hear about Norse myths in fourth grade, myths of ancient Persia and Egypt and Greece, Rome, Islam. So right in there, that's when our middle school is really taking on those exciting things. And in a traditional Waldorf high school, that's when we'll begin to go move into the blue line. But also many of the things that you'll see on the blue line, you'll also see in many other high schools and represented in different ways. Oh, yes, of course, resources. We as Waldorf teachers continue to strive to better ourselves as individuals and improve our work as teachers. And so Teacher Cheryl was so kind to gather some of these resources for us, for anyone who is interested.
Yeah, and several of these articles really pretty directly address the questions about the violence in the Grimm's fairy tales and in other stories that we tell in Waldorf curriculum, and you know how the child processes them. Um, you know, some of that we touched on here, but if you want a deeper look into that, these are some good articles to look at and read further.
I believe if we hit play, it should work. I'm not sure if we have time for that. It's a very sweet story.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, we go. Yeah, I realized I was still muted. I was changing the settings so you can hear.
Thank you. Anything can happen in fairy tale or rhyme, beginning with the magic words, once upon a time. Once upon a time, there was a little girl whose father and mother were dead, and she was so poor that she had no room to live in or bed to sleep in. And at last, she had nothing left but the clothes she was wearing and a little bit of bread in her hand, which some charitable soul had given her. She was good and pious, however, and as she was thus forsaken by the whole world, she went forth into the open country, trusting in the great good. Then a poor man met her, who said, "Please, give me something to eat. I have no food for days." She handed him the whole of her piece of bread, said blessings to you, and went onwards. Then came a child who moaned and said, "My head is so cold. Please give me something to cover it with." So she took off her hood and gave it to him. And when she had walked a little further, there came another child who had no jacket and was frozen with the cold. Then she gave it her own. And a little further on, one begged for a frock, and she gave away that also. At length, she got into the forest, and it had already become dark. And there came yet another child who asked for a shirt. And the good little girl thought to herself, "It is a dark night, and no one sees you. You can very well give your shirt away." And she took it off and gave that away also.
And as she so stood, with not a single thing left, suddenly some stars from the heavens fell down round her, and they were nothing but hard, smooth pieces of money. And although she had just given her shirt away, she now had a new one, which was of the very finest linen. Then she put the money into it and was rich for the rest of her days.